In this section, I will be showing you a lot of photographs of both airbrushed artwork as well as photographs of actual fire. Some of the artwork that you will see is my own, some of it is not. So before we go any farther, I want to make it perfectly clear that I am not out to blast or berate another artist in any way. Part of my job as an instructor is not only to point out what an artist is doing really well, but it's also to provide tips and critiques in the areas where an artist may be struggling. I think it will be beneficial for you to get some visual references of some of the common mistakes I see when it comes to creating fire versus me just trying to describe it in words to you. So let's look at the first picture. This artist did a really nice job picking their colors for one. They are bright and vibrant, which is exactly what you would want when you are rendering fire. I also like how the dark red color you see, which is the flames in the background, the furthest flames back. That dark red color is very nice, it's vibrant, and it dissipates very well. It fades into the background very softly. There's very little, if any, stencil use in that initial red layer when this artist painted these flames. I also like how they were able to dissipate the color when using their stencils. Let me demonstrate what I mean by that. Say we want to begin to build a flame lick up in the left corner of this piece of paper. And I'm just going to use Createx Illustration Opaque Black for demonstration purposes. So using a freehand shield to begin building a shape, we'll lay the freehand shield onto the surface that we're painting, and then we can begin spraying around one of our curved shapes. And make sure your paint is dry before you flip the stencil over and use the other side. It's a good habit to get into to make sure the paint is dry on your freehand shield before you stick it back on the canvas. So at this point we would want to create the other side of this flame lick. To do that, I would simply move the freehand shield up a little bit and then begin spraying against that. You see what I just did here? This is another common error that I see pretty frequently when it comes to rendering fire, is I filled in all of this space between where we use the freehand shield. Every now and then that's okay, but for the most part you don't want to do that. You want to allow the paint to dissipate and fade away so that you can still see through the center section of this flame lick, so that you can see the layers that you created underneath. It really makes no sense to start out building an initial layer and then building other layers over it if you can't see what you did previously. Does that make sense? So the way we would want to do this is very much the same. We'll pick a shape on our freehand shield and begin building a little bit of a flame lick. And you see how that dissipates nicely back into the white. So the same thing again, we can come back up now we can actually see through the center of that flame lick. So you'll be able to see the layers that you previously painted between those two flame licks. You may not be able to see through this section right here or this section right here, but right here you'll be able to see through it just fine. Here's a photograph of an actual fire to kind of illustrate what I'm talking about. If you look at this image, you'll see some opaque areas, but you'll also see a lot of transparent areas, and that's what we're looking for. One of my favorite little licks in this particular photograph is down towards the bottom, where you see this really bright yellow highlight or hot spot Directly above that, it's more of an orange color, and that orange fades or dissipates into almost nothing as it travels upward. The edges, the left edge and the right edge, are pretty well defined with the brighter, more opaque orange, but the center of it dissipates almost into nothing. So much so that you can actually see some of the black background behind that lick. And it's not necessary to have a hard edge on every single flame lick. Let's go back to the photograph. In this area I have highlighted now, you can see an orange flame lick traveling upward, but there's not a defining edge on the left or the right. It just dissipates and fades into nothing. So one of the keys to creating believable fire with your airbrush is having a good balance between those opaque areas as well as the translucent or transparent areas. That's one of the keys that will help to improve your results. Let's go back to the artist's picture that we looked at just a few minutes ago. And again, you can see, especially in this area, a lot of translucency or transparency in this artist's fire. You can see through some of the opaque areas as well as some of the dissipated areas down to lines in the underlying layers. So let's discuss some things that could use some improvement. The first thing that jumps out to me is one of the mistakes that I see more often than anything else. And that is that this artist got a little carried away with the freehand shield. There are virtually no freehand strokes in this image. It's all been done with a freehand shield. It literally looks like the artist took a freehand shield, put it on the canvas, and started spraying shapes very similar to these two all over the canvas. And that does not create a believable, realistic fire when you're airbrushing. The other issue that I see that really stands out to me is it looks like the artist was using the same shape over and over and over again. If you look at the image or images similar to this one closely, a lot of times I see what looks like the plastic six-pack rings all over the place, and that's not a good thing. Looking at this image, it's chaos. It's very hectic. There's no structure to the fire. And what you have to realize is what we're discussing in this instructional video is a very stylized version of fire. We are not going for photorealism. It's a stylized, artistic interpretation of what fire could look like. So each individual artist will be able to influence their own work in their own way. But you have to make that appealing to the viewer in order to make it work. That's another one of the keys to improving your fire, is making it appealing to the viewer. How can we do that? For one, fire has a story. It has to have a beginning and it has to have an end. If you look at this picture, it's chaos. There is no beginning, there is no end, there's no structure to the fire. That's what we need to achieve, is to develop the start of the story, the middle of the story, and the end of the story. Can we see chaos like this image in nature? You bet we can. Here's an image of a real fire that is pretty chaotic. There's not really a beginning or an end. It's going in multiple different directions. It's chaos. So I'll pose this question to you. Would you take the image we just looked at and paint that as is on the side of a vehicle? Personally, I would not, and here's why. When you paint fire on the side of a vehicle, you want the fire to complement the shape of the vehicle. You want it to accent the vehicle's lines. Logically, the beginning of the fire, the beginning of the story, should start at the front of the car. That doesn't necessarily mean that it needs to end at the back of the car. It could end at a back door, a front door, or even the front fender. But it's more appealing to the viewer's eyes if you use that approach. Here's an example. I'll superimpose the image we just looked at a minute ago onto the side of a vehicle as is. Now that's not terrible looking, but it's not as appealing to the eye compared to, say, this image. Another common issue I see quite often is artists tend to use those circular shaped voids a lot in their fire. What I referred to a few minutes ago that sometimes reminds me of the plastic 6-pack rings. Part of that has to do with the fact that we are using freehand shields that are primarily circular shapes. Another part of that has to do with the fact that I think a lot of artists try to make this stuff up off the top of their head. You can get away with that once you've done quite a few of these and you figure out how to structure the fire, how to lay out the fire, how to begin the story, add the middle of the story, and the end of the story. Until you get to that point, I strongly advise you to use photographic references. Whether you want to use references of actual fire or references of airbrushed fire that other artists have created, it doesn't matter. But you need to be looking at something to give you guidance as far as how to lay out your fire. If you look at actual photographs of fire, you will see voids in the fire, but it's pretty rare that you'll see circular shapes. Every now and then you will see them, but you won't see as many circular shapes or circular shaped voids in true fire, actual fire, as you will in an artist's rendition of fire. Here's a few images. In this first image, you actually see a circular shaped void in the upper right hand corner. But if you look at the other voids, they're not so much circles. There are some curved areas in the voids, but they don't look like circles. Again, you will see far less circular shaped voids in nature compared to what you will see in artists' renditions of fire. Same thing here. Some nice voids, but none of these are circular in nature. I am not saying do not use voids in your artwork when you're painting fire. And I'm not saying do not use circular shaped voids in your fire. Fire is a living, breathing thing. Those voids help to show movement, and it also helps to create the illusion of depth in your artwork, which makes it more appealing. It makes it look more realistic. I still use voids in pretty much every fire job that I paint. Some of them are circular shaped. Be mindful though of how often you're using the same shapes and try to space them out. You don't want to just randomly lay your stencil or freehand shield onto the canvas and spray. You've got to have some structure to your fire. Here's a picture of the side of a truck that I painted a very long time ago. You can see I've still got some circular shaped voids in the fire, but there's not that many and it's not random. Now my own artwork does not escape criticism either. Let's take another look at that picture. I did not do a very good job of fading the background flames into the black base coat of this particular truck. The transition between those two was not smooth and gradual like I would prefer it to be. Some of these areas are a little too opaque. I lost some of that transparent quality of the fire. And I just mentioned a few minutes ago to be mindful of not using the same shape over and over and over again. If you take a look at this one little area right here, you can see that I had the exact same shape stacked up 3 in a row. So let's look at another picture. And this time I will encourage you to pause the video, take a good look at this artist's work, pick out what you like and pick out what you think could use some improvement, and then compare your results with what I'm going to give you. There's a good choice of colors in this example as well. There's a good story. There's a beginning which starts in the brighter or hotter yellow areas of the mailbox, and then that gradually transitions to the oranges and red colors you see. I also like the fact that the end of this story tapers off nicely. The flames don't end in just a flat line. So that's a good thing. What can use some improvement? Once again, there is a lot of stencil use in this example, and it looks like the artist used the same shape over and over and over again. There is virtually no freehand strokes in this example of fire that I can see whatsoever. There may be a few too many layers in this fire as well. It's a good idea to use multiple layers in your fire. I would suggest 2 to 3 at the most, depending on the colors that you're working with. If you put too many layers in your fire, it becomes distracting and you actually lose some of that depth that you'll achieve with lesser layers. Again, the old adage that less is more applies here. Same thing with the stencil use. There's nothing wrong with using your freehand shields and stencils. They're a vital tool when it comes to rendering or creating the fire. But again, you can't depend on a freehand shield to create all of the fire for you. You've got to use some artistic license in the process as well. This artist has some opaque areas in their fire, and they also have some translucent areas. So it's a good balance between the two, I think, in this example. Does fire always travel in the same direction, whether it's low to high, right to left, or left to right? No, of course not. Fire can move in pretty much any direction it wants. I found a cool picture online that kind of illustrates the point. You can see this flame going straight up before it makes a horizontal turn, then it turns again and comes straight back before traveling up again. That's a cool picture, and it illustrates my point, but I wouldn't necessarily recommend that you try to replicate that particular photograph in your artwork. It's a little bit on the extreme side. However, adding directional changes in your fire will go a long way to improving the results you get. It makes it more believable. It can help you follow the flow of a vehicle or a panel, whatever you happen to be working on. Here's a few examples of my own. This is a racing lawnmower hood. Yes, you heard that correctly. It was a racing lawnmower hood. We do things a little different in Oklahoma, that I painted many years ago. It's hard to see in this picture, but the hood had fire pretty much following straight up the hood. On the side, however, you can see how I angled it up very slightly just to try and show some movement. I wanted the lawnmower to look like it was going fast even when it was sitting still. This one had some issues in it too. I got a little bit heavy with the paint. It was a little opaque in all of the areas. I kind of lost the transparent quality in the fire, but again, I was learning. I was trying to figure out how to do this back then. Here's another example of a Mustang that I painted. Very similarly, on the hood, you can see the fire pretty much follows the hood straight back. But again, on the side of the car, it was angled up slightly to accent the flow of the car as well as make it look like it was moving when it was sitting still. One more example is a golf cart that I painted for Kicker many years ago. In this particular example, I wanted the fire behind the logo to almost look like it was exploding behind it. So you get some different directional changes in this one as well. You've heard me mention the lack of freehand strokes several times now. What do I mean by that? Airbrushing fire is no different than airbrushing anything else. You want a good balance between your freehand shield use or stencil use and your actual freehand airbrush skills. You want a balance of hard edges and soft edges. Remember a few minutes ago I showed you a picture of actual fire with a column of fire traveling up that has a soft edge on both sides. You can replicate that with freehand strokes. You don't need a shield or a stencil in order to create that effect. But it goes beyond that. If you go back to the picture and look just to the right of the column we were just looking at, you'll see what looks like a bright orange line traveling up parallel with it. You can create that with a freehand dagger stroke or just a freehand line. Take a closer look at the rest of this picture and you'll start to see lines popping out all over the place. And it's not just this specific picture. You can do the same thing with pretty much any picture of actual fire that you will find. This is one of the keys that will really improve your fire and make it more believable, in my opinion. Adding some lines here and there, and again, keeping a balance. You don't want to just randomly start putting lines into your fire, much the same as we wouldn't just start randomly placing a stencil onto the panel and spraying around it. You have to have structure, you have to have form, you have to have flow in your fire. Less is more. But use reference images and pick out little lines where you see lines in the fire of your reference images and add them to your artwork. It will go a long way to improving the results you get. Here's an example of a helmet that I painted at one time where if you look closely, you'll see a few little lines here and there. Not a lot, but there is a few. The last thing I want to address is something that I don't see very often, but it's worth mentioning. It has to do with the scale of your fire. You want to paint your fire at a scale that corresponds with the object that you're painting. For example, an extreme example, let's say you want to paint a small scale model car and put fire on it. You're not going to paint the fire on that scale model car the same size that you would if you were painting an actual vehicle. Does that make sense? Scaling your work also has to do with the body or the width of your fire. Obviously, if you're painting something larger, you want a better width, a better body to your fire instead of a lot of very narrow strokes that won't look natural. I know that was a lot of information to cover. It's a lot to digest and soak in. So let's do a quick recap before we move on to some practical exercises. My top 5 tips for improving your fire begins with number 1, which is dissipation. You want good dissipation in your fire, especially at that base layer. You want to use very little stencils, if any, on your initial base layer of fire. You want it to fade out into the base color softly and smoothly. That goes for the background and also the foreground. Remember, we talked about dissipation in your flame licks so that you can keep some of that translucent quality in your fire. You want a good balance between opaque areas, but you also want a good balance with some translucent and transparent areas in your fire. That will bring a lot of more realism to your work. Number 2, be easy on your shields. Don't fall into the trap of repeating the same shape over and over and over again. Use your shields sparingly. As I just said, in that first base layer, I will generally use very little, maybe sometimes no shields at all. And you want to reseed your layers the same way with your shield. So the next layer you can start to use a little bit more shield work, and then the next layer you can really tighten it up. Michael Valley always said work it loose to tight. I agree with that 100%. Number 3 is structure. You have got to have structure in your fire. You cannot just randomly start laying your stencil down and spraying it and go, hey, look, I made fire. It doesn't work that way. Remember to have a start and an end to your story. You're telling a story, you have to have good flow. Remember to add some different direction changes in your work. It doesn't always have to flow in a straight line. It actually looks better when you add some direction changes. Again, reseed your layers. The hotter fire is generally at the start of the story, which would be your yellows, whites, and then it gradually recedes into oranges and reds. The same thing with building your fire. You want the layers to recede. So that initial background layer might be wide, but then the next layer is going to be a little bit narrower and a little bit narrower. Does that make sense? Easy on the voids. There's nothing wrong with keeping voids in your fire. We talked about that earlier. It's a good thing to have some voids, but you want to control them. You don't need voids all over the place, and that plays into the scale thing too. If you're painting something larger, then maybe fewer voids is going to fill that gap a little bit better than putting a lot of voids. And a void using the same shapes on your voids as well. Try to use some different shapes in those voids. At the end of the day, you want all of this to be appealing to the viewer's eyes. That's the whole goal, and that comes down to the structure and the flow of your work. Number 4 is reference images. Again, you need to use reference images when you're doing this. For whatever reason, fire is extremely hard to learn for a lot of artists, including myself. And I'm talking seasoned artists, not just the people who are beginning at all of this. I've seen more people struggle with this technique and effect from a teaching standpoint than I've ever seen anybody struggle with anything else. Any other effect when it comes to airbrushing. I've seen more people struggle with fire, true fire, realistic flames, whatever you want to call it, than anything else ever. And that includes myself. I had a hard time figuring out how to do all this in the beginning. I don't know what the reason is behind that, but it's difficult. Once you've done a lot of these, then you can start to make things up on your own, because you'll have a good idea of how things flow and work, what looks good and what doesn't. But when you're starting, use reference images. I've done a lot of these. I don't do them as often as I used to because it's not quite as popular as it once was. And that plays into it as well, because I think this is somewhat of a perishable skill. It's one of those things, if you don't do it frequently, you start to get rusty, you start to forget things. So I still use reference images even when I do them now. I don't use them as often or as much as I once did, but I'm still using reference images. Finally, the last tip, number 5, is freehand strokes. You've got to incorporate freehand strokes into your work. That will go a long ways into making your work more believable, making it look more realistic, and it doesn't look as contrived because you've got some freehand strokes. Again, it's a blend between using hard edges, soft edges, freehand shields, and freehand strokes. It's all a balance.